In this video, we'll be using CurveSuite to generate bandages around this character's limbs and torso. Here I have this base human model. This was distributed by the Blender Foundation alongside a lot of other mesh assets. You can probably find it by googling Blender human base meshes. These are completely free to use. This will be a particularly convoluted workflow process because we have a lot of modifiers to use and utilize. But on the flip side, this will hopefully be a great demonstration of what each of these modifiers are capable of and when they can be used. To start off, I will be adding in a curve circle object. This will be our bandage wrapping proxy. So I will be naming it bandage proxy. And I will try to align it with the character's arm as much as possible. To that end, I will be using the snap to face nearest. Make sure it is set to closest. And by holding in control, we can make sure that the curve snaps to the nearest surface point. I will create 3 duplicates of the curve, which will be a good starting point. And then underneath restriction toggles, I will enable the selectable toggle to be visible. And then I will select or make sure that our base human model is not selectable. This is a very good quality of life to have because as you drag and drop modifiers on curve objects, because they are very small, it can be very tricky. And any object that isn't selectable will be excluded from adding modifiers. Underneath mesh generation, I will go to our bridge curves with mesh and add it to our bandage proxy. And I will set our rendering color to be random so that there is a bit more contrast between our bandage proxy and our base mesh. And once we have added the bridge curves with mesh modifier, you can see it has created this pseudo cylinder where the top face and the bottom face are missing. And this particular area right here is a bit of a seam where the vertices aren't actually connected. There's an actual cut in between. And we can adjust the resolution along the side of the fake cylinder. But as far as the resolution along the length of the cylinder goes, our only option right now is to just create new edge loops, which can be a bit of an overwhelming process, especially if you want high resolution. And since we will be using this as a proxy to create a bandage, we want it to line up with the underlying mesh as much as possible. To that end, I will be using a shrink wrap modifier. I will set the snap mode to project. I will set the outside surface. I will add in a 0.05 meter limit. I will be targeting our base model. I'll project both on the negative and the positive directions. I will add in a bit of an offset. Now, this isn't perfect, where we get these intersections with the underlying mesh because of the resolution issue. And one way to fix this resolution issue is to just, as mentioned before, add in more edge loops over and over again. But then you have a lot of curves to deal with. There is an actual much easier way to deal with this. If you use the bridge curves with subcurves modifier and place it before our bridge curves with mesh modifier, we get this very bizarre flaring. This is because bridge curves with subcurves uses Bezier curves, and these Bezier curves handles are displaced based on the radius parameter of our existing curves, which can be useful when creating elaborate shapes, but in our case we just want it to be as simple as possible, so I will hit Alt S and then hit 0 to set the radius of these curves to 0, which will then make the subcurves generated by our modifier straight lines that connect these curves circles. Now if we re-enable our bridge curves with mesh modifier, we'll also enable our shrink wrap. I'll hide the body for now. Now we have two different modifiers with count parameters. By increasing the bridge curves with subcurves, or first modifier's count parameter, we can add in new edge loops around the side of our fake cylinder. And increasing the count for our bridge curves with mesh modifier adds in new edge loops along the length of our cylinder. Now we have this gap right here in between the start and end of our mesh generated by bridge curves with mesh. By toggling closed loop, we can actually connect this part, no problem. And one thing about these modifiers is, if we set the count to be 0, it will actually use the resolution of the curve object to determine the count of vertices. In the case of bridge curves with mesh, and in the case of bridge curves with subcurves, it will use the resolution of our curved circles. Now we can then change the resolution of our curved circles here to increase the resolution that is being fed into our subcurves, but the subcurves resolution is independent from that. So to control that, we actually have our resample curve modifier. If we place it before our bridge curves with mesh, now suddenly, by making sure that we disable this tick box, which will then use the length parameter, we can actually add in new circles or displace the existing circles. And you can see as I'm pushing this circle, new edge loops are being added along the length of the cylinder. Now we can duplicate our resample curve modifier and place it at the top of the stack as well. Because our first resample curve was after bridge curves with subcurves, it was resampling the generated subcurves. Whereas by placing one before our bridge curves with subcurves modifier, we can resample these circles instead, which will then let us scale one of the existing circles. And by taking the size of the largest circle, the bridge curves with subcurves modifier will use the resolution of that circle to be the basis for the vertex count along the side of the cylinder. Now you might have noticed that as we scale up this circle, we occasionally get this seam issue. I haven't quite figured out why this is happening. Once I do, this modifier will be patched to avoid it. But for now, the easiest way to fix it is to just make sure that when it happens, just scale your largest circle a little bit or change the values in the modifier itself. But by using these two different resample curve modifiers stacked, so we have resample curve at the top, bridge curves with subcurves with count set to 0 below it, and then another resample curve, and then bridge curves with mesh with count set to 0 below it, we get this highly adaptive setup where whether it's the arm or the torso, the resolution of our final cylinder will adapt to the scale of what you're working with. You can see we have two different shapes. One is much bigger than the other one, but the overall size or the average size of the faces in each one is pretty consistent. This will be very useful because once we have this part fully set up, we can just, as I just did, copy this object and then align it with other body parts. Now that we have our Bandage proxy mostly set up, we can work towards setting up the rest of the parts to use with different UVs. To start off, I will add in a mesh plane, which will be our UV proxy. I will displace it along the x-axis a little bit so that it is far away from the rest of the setup. And to showcase how the deformed UVs works, I will add in a cone object. This will be only for demonstration. So I will also add in a Bezier curve, which will be our actual bandage. And then on our bandage proxy, I will add in a deformed UV modifier. I will select our cone the object parameter, and for our UV proxy parameter, I will select our plane. I'll change our asset browser window to be a 3D viewport. So we get to see both this part of the world space as well as our actual proxy. Now the cylinder itself seems to be poking downwards, which if we enable facial orientation, you can see the bridge curves with mesh modifier is actually pointed inwards. So I will hit flip faces so that the normals of the bandage proxy is consistent. So now the triangle is actually pointing outwards, or the cone is pointing outwards. Now the way deformed UVs works is it takes this target object, finds its position in the UV space on our UV proxy object, and then displaces it to the bandage proxy's world space position based on bandage proxy's UV space. What this means is, if I create a duplicate without the different UVs, if I move this cone around, it will move around the UV proxy or the bandage proxy object accordingly. And the displacement along the normal is also dependent on its distance to our UV proxy, where if we move it along the z-axis, we can push it in or elevate it above the surface. We can scale it down. We can also scale it along the other axes. So this could be useful to create spikes or something else in a similar nature as well. And for our purposes, we will be creating a bandage, so I will get rid of it. And as our object, I will select the bandage curve, which immediately looks wrong. You can see this bandage curve is laying flat on our UV proxy, but it is creating this wild loop when it is being instanced on our bandage proxy. This isn't a bug per se, but rather how Bezier curves work, where the curve itself is made of many segments, which is controlled by this resolution parameter. But it is shaped by these two control points and these handles, where the direction of the handle determines the direction of the curve segment that connects these 2 points, and the distance this handle has to the control point determines the influence this control point has over the in-between segments. So if we get the handle very closely to its control point, it gets very close to being a straight line. And now suddenly this part doesn't really stick out as much. But ultimately, what the UV proxy modifier is doing is it takes these control points and then places them with their handles over to where our bandage proxy object was. And because of these handles, displacement controls the in-between segment, it can be very inconsistent between our bandage object and our bandage proxy object. There are two ways to fix this. The easier way, which I do not recommend, is just using polycurves instead. If we draw a polycurve, it will line up perfectly. Or another way is by still using Bezier curves, we can go to our asset browser. I will hide our UV proxy for now. We can use our resample curve on our bandage to turn it into a polycurve procedurally, which lets us maintain the Bezier curves advantages, such as easy editing, but without the previous issue where the handles are being displaced as is, and then the curve itself is not really following the shape we're defining here. Up next, in our asset browser, I will be adding in a curve to mesh modifier, which looks very wrong because the scale is way off. We can reduce the scale here with the modifier. But another thing we can do is, since this bandage proxy is an exact copy of this bandage just displaced onto the fake cylinder we have created, we can actually control it by editing our bandage object. So by changing the tilt of this curve, this instance is being affected as well. But either way, the curve to mesh modifier by default creates a triangle profile, which is not ideal. So I will be adding in a path object, which will be our bandage profile. I will then select this profile object to be our profile. And the resolution is way high, so I will be reducing it. We really do not need this many faces. Now you could try to line it up by adjusting the tilt of our bandage curve, but I believe it, well, I do not believe, I know that there is a much easier way. We can just use our align curve to surface modifier and place it before our curve to mesh, but after our deformed UVs. And we set our body to be the wrapping object. And now it wraps around the body much better. Now we have our bandage object we can edit, create the bandage desired. But right now we are limited to only a single loop of bandage. We can create new bandages on this object, but these will each be additional loops. And what we can do here is, if you go to edit mode in UV proxy, you can see that any change we make here actually affects the bandage profile or bandage proxy as well. So we can actually add in an array modifier, and we can just create new UV proxies along the y-axis, say 32 for now. And I will scale this down on the y-axis. Oh, that's not it. What's happening is this curve is going outside of the UV proxy. I haven't noticed that. So if you just move it back in, yep, there we go. So now that we have multiple UV proxy objects, we can just keep looping around the arm as much as we want. So if I just go here, this will just be 2 loops. Yeah, if I just go for a bit, this will be many, many loops. And finally, since we've demonstrated that the distance our bandage has to our UV proxy affects the distance of our generated bandage on the arm, we can actually just go to edit mode and rotate our final curve along its x-axis a little bit. This will create a difference in height between the start and end points. So now the bandages are actually layered on top of one another. And we can adjust the scale of our UV proxy to determine how many times the curve itself will go around the arm. One thing you might have noticed that is as we scale the UV proxy, the resolution of the curve isn't really changing, or rather the resolution of our final bandage generated on the bandage proxy isn't really changing. It's just that as it is doing more and more loops, each face is covering a larger area. So the solution to this is also very simple. You might have even guessed it by now, but if we add in a resample curve modifier after our deformed UVs but before our curve to mesh, we can also make this part dynamic. You can just determine a length to make it adapt to the size it is at. Or alternatively, if you have a particular poly budget, you can just use the count parameter. But you might have noticed that as we scaled this UV proxy around, at some point the curve itself starts to look funky. This is because we have the resample curve after our align curve to surface, where because the tilt parameter is in radians, where 360 degrees equals 0, this can cause issues with the resampling after our alignment. If you are the resample curve before align curve to surface, you will not run into this problem. As a final step, if you want, you can add in another shrink wrap modifier to outside to make sure that any vertices that remain inside the body, even after the instancing, are actually displaced to be outside of it to minimize the intersections with the body. Alternatively, you can also just adjust the positioning of your bandage object. If you're not happy with the overall shape of the bandage, you can always just make adjustments on edit mode here. You could even have multiple curves within the same object. There isn't really a technical limitation that prevents this. You could have one of the bandages thinner by adjusting the scale, or rather the radius of it by Alt S. Depending on what exactly it is you're trying to accomplish, you could even apply the array modifier to your UV proxy and then make edits to your UV proxy object. Just make sure that your bandage curve object actually stays within the bounds of your UV proxy, or it can get very weird. Once you have a relatively good setup, you can just copy your object. Place the new object to line up with other parts of your mesh. You might have noticed that when I create a duplicate of a curve loop here, it gets very bizarre. If we mute everything after our bridge curves with mesh, and hide our body, let's also just take this opportunity to fix the alignment of this curve, because twists like that can cause issues with the deformation. If I duplicate this curve, it isn't being extended from this part, it is being extended from the bottom. This is because the order in which these curves are connected is dependent on their indices, which unfortunately isn't really something you can control in edit mode. So either you can keep that in mind and work by always extending the most recent curve, because the oldest curve has an index of 0, and then every other curve after that it just has an index based on its age. So the newest curve is always the one that will be extended from in terms of this particular setup. One way to circumvent this sort of process is if you create a curve loop, for example, and then separate it by selection. Of course, you have to select the curve separation. I will hide the modifier so it is visible. And if we select our old one and then our new one by hitting Control J to join the modifiers, it will then create a new ordering for them. So you can use that to create, or not create, but add in curve loops in between. Just select the ones that you want to be the first ones, including the one you most recently added. Separate them to their separate objects, and then Control J. The ordering matters. Where the first one you selected will be the first curves. So this object we select first, and then we select the one that you want to add on top of it, and then suddenly the curve that was previously the newest one, and thus was at the end of our fake cylinder, is now in the middle. As a final demonstration, I will showcase how you can easily create variations on these Bandage setups, because previously we had these new Bandage proxies as exact copies of our initial proxy, which is still using the same UV proxy and Bandage objects and profile curve. One thing you can do is by separating everything that is part of one setup into one collection, you can duplicate collection, which will then create these exact copies, but these copies will be actually targeting the copies of our UV proxy, Bandage, and Bandage profile in their modifier parameters. And they will also have their own data block associated with them. So we have this new Bandage proxy. For example, we can go to edit mode here, scale by -1 on the x-axis because we have our curve or 3D cursor at the center. And we may need to disable flip faces. Yes, we do. And now suddenly we have our proxy objects as well. And we can make edits to our proxy objects. And these will only affect our new copies. So you can very quickly create new variations of the same bandage. It doesn't have to be that the both arms and the legs and the torso have the same exact wrapping setup. It is very quick to make adjustments in this way. Hopefully this was a good demonstration of what can be possible with the modifiers. If you have any further questions or requests, feel free to contact me directly or leave a comment.